Thank you guys for being here. Can y'all hear me okay? I'm the only one that's mic'd today, so okay, good. Thank y'all for being here. Look, if as you guys can see, we're new. We're going through some growing pains, so we're learning how to deal with some of these things, how to record, how to set this stuff up. So right off the bat here, we're going to have some issues. Just bear with us, and thank you for bearing with us. But we're going to get all this stuff worked out. It's going to be awesome. So it's also pretty amazing. We always talk on Mondays, like tomorrow we'll have our meeting about what we're going to do for the next week. And it's so funny because we talked about what we were going to do, and Clay knew that I was going to be doing this section of John, and he said, okay, I'm going to just talk about the doctrinal part. I'm going to talk about Christology. That was the extent of the conversation right there. That was it. But it's so funny because everything that he talked about leads perfectly into what I'm going to talk about today. It's just so funny how all this works. And it's just really amazing. So I'm going to get into it. All right. Everybody see that okay? All right. I'm talking about this part of John, chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, okay? Before we really get into this, I'm going to go back into a little bit of history. Everybody, if y'all been here before, you guys know that I like to kind of bring the historical and cultural context in this as well, because I want everybody to kind of get the feel of where we are. Where is all this happening? What does all this mean, and why here? Where? I mean, that's an amazing part. And I really always knew that, but it really didn't affect me until I actually went there. And then it became a big deal, and I understood it a lot more. So as I talked a couple of weeks ago, the Mediterranean Sea is what was called basically the highway of the ancient world. The Romans, everybody who traveled across this whole region, Greece, even Israel, North Africa, Italy, Rome, all of that, they were all tied together by the Mediterranean Ocean. You either had to walk a long way around from Africa to get to Greece and Italy. You had to walk a long way, or you took a ship. And that was the main mode of travel back in that day. So understand that we're talking about that region inside that Mediterranean Ocean. Well, we're looking here at Turkey, okay? Greece is right across the Mediterranean from Turkey. And in Turkey, you have Smyrna. You guys are all familiar with Smyrna, one of the 7 churches of Revelation, which is Izmir. That's what the actual name of Smyrna is Izmir now. And Izmir is an actual city that exists in Turkey. Ephesus was a port city right here, basically, where that arrow is pointing, and it was right on the ocean. And it's a very important city, okay? This is where, basically, John wrote the book of John, okay? So, give you a little history. This was basically after the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? The Apostle John was believed to have settled in Ephesus. Wealthy port city located on major trade routes, okay? This is what connected all of these ancient cities together where they were able to trade and do commerce. Okay, but the culture now was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, which Clay talked about. The Greek philosophers had a lot of influence in the world at this time. And intellectualism. It was like everybody thought that the more knowledge they had, the more important they were. It was also influenced heavily by Roman political power and emperor worship, which became, Clay talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where the emperors, they started off as just leaders and rulers, but it became that the emperors started becoming worshipped like gods. They demanded that worship. They believed in their minds that they were on an equal level with the gods at that time. So that was going on at the time as well. Mystery religions that promise secret spiritual knowledge. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. And then occult practices and ancient gods that they were worshiping, and they believed that they controlled the areas. Okay, these were all common in Ephesus. Every ancient city back then had these temples, and a lot of them were different. And in Ephesus, the main temple that existed at this time was the Temple of Artemis. So Artemis was the key god of the city of Ephesus at that time. She had a major temple that existed for the worship of Artemis, okay? And that's what kind of gave the city its identity. This is an actual picture that I took when we were in Ephesus, a month ago? Maybe? Probably a little over a month ago. We actually went to Ephesus, and it was amazing. This is all that exists right now of the Temple of Artemis. Basically, one column that's standing, and then this other shorter column. This is where the actual Temple of Artemis was. This was a glorious, huge temple that is no longer there anymore, as you can see. Okay, up on the hill, which in the background is, I'll talk about that here in a second, but that's the St. John's Basilica. And this is Ephesus. This was the main road in Ephesus that's leading down to the Library of Celsus, who was a Roman historian. And in that library were tons of records. Now, think about this. Paul spent 3 years in Ephesus. He spent a lot of time here. He walked these streets. These were actual marble streets that you can walk on today that existed back at that time. It's really amazing. But think about it. You got Paul, you had John. These guys all spent a lot of time right here in Ephesus. They probably walked these same roads. Okay. As John ministered in Ephesus, he likely confronted several growing theological challenges. Okay, early Gnosticism. You guys have heard of Gnosticism. It's special knowledge, that they believed that they had special knowledge, and through that knowledge, they were able to attain divine capabilities. At this time of John, even though it wasn't fully developed yet, early forms of Gnostic thought were emerging. These teachings claim that salvation came through secret knowledge, gnosis, and often denied that Jesus truly came in the flesh, because what they believed was that the flesh was evil and the spirit was divine. So anything that had to do with anything flesh was totally bad. Obviously, emperor worship as well. The emperors were increasingly honored as divine figures. Citizens were expected to participate in imperial cult practices, creating tension for Christians, okay, who confessed Jesus as Lord. So there was a lot of, that's where some persecution had started as well. And then obviously there was a lot of paganism. The influence of Artemis worship and numerous other pagan temples challenged believers to remain faithful to Christ. So this was all going on in Ephesus. Ephesus was a very pagan city, okay? This right here was probably the most impactful thing that I saw over there. The Apostle John spent a lot of time in Ephesus. They believe that he died there. This is the tomb of the Apostle John, and it's truly believed to be his tomb. It's not just, we think this is it. So when we were there and I saw this, and I didn't even know this was there. It just really impacted me a whole lot, because, I mean, we were standing right there on the ground where the Apostle John, the person who wrote the Gospel of John, who was Jesus' favorite, loved apostle, is buried. I mean, it was amazing. And as you can see, it's the tomb of St. John. It was amazing. So all these things are going on. This is Ephesus. This is, John lived there, probably the last part of his life. Now he was there. We'll talk about this here on this slide. So this kind of explains why he was writing the book of John, because he wanted to get across the true deity of Jesus Christ. Okay, above everything else that was going on. He wanted to write about that. He wanted to talk about the humanity of Christ. We're going to see this theme going on. Clay talked about it. We're going to see this theme. Alex talked about it last week. Okay, we're going to touch on that too as kind of a recap. Light versus darkness. Okay, paganism versus belief in Christ. Truth versus deception. Okay, John was big on combating these false teachers that were emerging and causing a lot of havoc with what the Christians were believing in that area. And then love as evidence of genuine faith. John talks about that a lot, especially in 1 John. Okay, and then exclusive trust in Jesus as Lord amid emperor worship and idolatry. So these are all the things that's going on. So keep this in mind as we start talking about all of these issues. So John 1 through 1:19 is basically referred to as the prologue of John. This is where the Apostle John wanted to really put forth of the idea and lay it out of who Jesus was. It's the theological foundation for everything that follows in the book of John. Okay? So John introduces Jesus as the eternal Word, the Logos that Clay talked about. He's fully God, yet he's distinct from the Father, and he is through whom all things were created. The prologue traces God's creation to the incarnation of Christ, resulting finally in the declaration that the invisible God has been perfectly revealed through his Son. Now I want to take a moment and I want to talk about Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's Genesis 1:1 right there. And then John 1:1, which is in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God and the Word was God. Now Alex taught on this last week, but I want to take a little bit of that Genesis 1 in the beginning. That very first word in the beginning is the Hebrew word bereshit, which we don't realize the connotations and the amount of detail that is in that one word. It's comprised of 3 different Hebrew words. The first word is bere, and then it's rosh and et. Okay, and in those words, it has to do with beginning. It has to do with began. That word bereshit, bara, has to do with generating the idea of when. Okay, so beginning, when, and creating. The rosh, this is the interesting word because it has to do with headship. It's got to do with chief. It's got to do with first, top level, leadership. That's what the rosh has to do with. So bereshit, in beginning, leadership, and then et has to also do with beginning as well. So it's all has to do with the very beginning. So taken together, John 1:1 and Genesis 1:1 provide one of Scripture's clearest demonstrations on the eternal deity of Christ. It marks the beginning of time, space, matter, and history in that one word, bereshit. Clay talked about the word arche. What John uses is enarche. It reaches beyond that beginning to reveal the eternal Word, the Logos, who already existed before time itself. Genesis introduces creation. John introduces the Creator. Okay, so that's the difference. The harmony of these two passages form a powerful testimony that Jesus Christ is eternal God, distinct from the Father, yet fully sharing the divine nature, and that all creation exists through him and for him. Okay, so in the opening words of the Bible, God reveals the beginning of all created things, and then in the opening of John's Gospel, he reveals the one who created. So I just thought that's amazing. There's a lot more to that. I would really like to do a Bible study on both of those openings. I think you'd feel a great Bible study, and I'd really like to do that at some point. So we'll see. We'll see if we can get to do that. Okay, so we know that John 1 is the foundation for the book of John. So it's not just an introduction. Like I said, it's a theological summary of God's redemptive plan. Jesus, the Creator, has entered his creation. That's a big deal. Alex talked about it last week. The Word dwelt among us. Okay, so he has entered creation now to reveal what? To reveal the Father and bring salvation to humanity. All right. So here's the passage that we're going to go through today. It's not much. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as the only Son of God from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him, John the Baptist, and cried out, "This is he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. God is the only Son who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." That's the passage that we're going to talk about today. Now, so let's break it down. Let's unpack all of this. "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Alex finished with this last week, so I'm kind of going back and kind of overlap a little bit and going to talk about that. "And we have seen his glory. Glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." There's a lot to that. The Word became flesh. John doesn't use the word a man. He doesn't say that the Word became a man. That would have been the word anthropos. He didn't say that the Word became a man. He said the Word became flesh. Think about that. It's the word sarx in Greek. It has to do with weakness. It has to do with our men's desires, their frailty, their mortality. Everything we feel, Jesus, he said the Word became flesh. So it's way more deep than just becoming a man. He became flesh. It emphasizes the humanity that John was trying to... John, think about it, guys. John hung out with Jesus for 3 years. Okay, so he knew Jesus intimately. He knew how Jesus felt. You know, he wasn't just this deity who hung out with them, who had no, he was only concerned about his mission. He was human just like us. He had his weaknesses. He had his frailty, his moments of what he thought. So John knew him. It didn't imply that he just became human. He entered the realm of human weakness, suffering, mortality, and pain. And we can see that in Romans 8:3. It said, "For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. And for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh." Hebrews 2:14, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things." And Philippians 2:7 says, "Being born in the likeness of men." He entered our fallen world, this creation, without becoming sinful. He entered it to redeem it. All right? And he dwelt among us. Alex talked about that last week too, how the flesh, he came and he lived among men. And he talked about the tabernacle being the place where God came down and dwelt among men in the Old Testament. And Jesus was tabernacled with us in the flesh. Okay, he talked about that. But it was the tabernacle being the meeting place where heaven and earth intersected, right? God dwells in heaven, but he actually occupied the tabernacle with his presence. And the claim by John is profound when he says that he dwelt among us, because now Jesus is that meeting place. He is that meeting place between heaven and earth. We are now occupied with Jesus' presence. Think about that. We are occupied with Jesus' presence. So it's more than just Jesus being that place that lives among us. We're occupied with that space now. And we have seen his glory. Most people, when they think about this, they think about the transfiguration on Mount Hermon, when Jesus went up with Peter, James, and John, and the Father basically revealed who Jesus was in front of them and showed his glory. I think it's a little more than that. I think John points elsewhere to that as well. And I think that's part of it. But I think in John 12:23, John says, "And Jesus answered them, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified.'" Okay, we have seen his glory. John 13:31 says, "When he had gone out, Jesus said, 'Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him.'" And in 17:1 he says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, 'Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you.'" So we're looking at Jesus' glorification. And I think that's what John is talking about. We have seen his glory through the resurrection and through the cross. We've seen that glory. And that's what I think that's what John's talking about. It's more than just what he saw at the Mount of Transfiguration. In verse 15, it says, John bore witness about him. This is kind of a little paragraph in this passage, in this prologue. Alex talked about John the Baptist last week because there's a little bit about John in the very beginning of this passage. But he said, John bore witness about him and cried out, This is he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. There's a lot in that statement. John's asserting all of the claims that he has presented with testimony of the evidence. We're big on evidence in here. If you guys remember when John the Baptist was in prison about to be beheaded, he sent a couple of his disciples to Jesus and just asked him, are you truly the one who has come? And what did Jesus tell him? He told him, look, go back and tell John, these people have seen me heal people. People have seen me raise people from the dead. They have seen me do these works. It's not about just, I've heard that Jesus did this. All of these things, these miracles that Jesus had presented were all evidence of who he was. So it's all evidential arguments that Jesus sent back to John. So John bearing witness is very important in this situation. Okay, God establishes this truth through witness testimony. Okay, if you guys remember, a matter is not confirmed by a single claim, but by the testimony of multiple witnesses. In Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15, it says, a single witness shall not rise up against a man. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. So John comes, bore witness about it. Okay? There was a man sent from God. This is John 1, 6, 8. This is what Alex read last week. Whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all may believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. So think about that. John the Baptist was God's designated witness. Okay, so when he says John bore witness about him, he is the one above anybody else that God had sent to do that exact job. And he who comes before me ranks before me because he was before me. Better translation of this is I'm using the ESV in this study here, but the better translation is actually in the NASB, which is for he existed before me. So where the ESV says because he was before me, the better translation, he existed before me. So that's not a statement about birthdays. That, Jesus was about 6 months. John the Baptist was about 6 months older than Jesus. Okay, it's a statement about superiority, and it's a statement about pre-existence. He existed before me. That's what John's saying here. He's not saying, he existed before me because he was born 6 months before me. That's not what he's saying, because he knew in the beginning was the Word. An affirmation that the Word existed before creation became flesh and is superior to every prophet. Jesus isn't merely older than John. He's eternal. And John the Baptist knew that. Think about this. John the Baptist was the final prophet of the Old Testament. In all of this passage right here, we're still talking Old Testament. That's the period that they were in, because these Gospels, by the time that John was writing this, Matthew, or probably Mark, was the very first Gospel that was written, and then Matthew and Luke's Gospel came out. So we really are kind of in the New Testament period about this time. But when Jesus was alive, John the Baptist was basically the final prophet of the Old Testament. All right? And he declares Christ's supremacy because he knew that Christ was eternal in his existence. He knew who he was. He knew who he was. In verse 16 it says, for whom his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. This was a fascinating verse for me doing this study. Because this study here, and we all know how rich this book of John is, but this first chapter is just amazing because John wanted to get across exactly who Jesus was. I mean, that was the main thing that he really wanted to get across. And he wanted people to understand how Jesus was God. Okay, he said, Colossians 2:9 says, for him, in him, all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. Okay, that's what John is talking about when he says, for from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The Greek word for fullness, pleroma, basically means fullness, completeness, totality, and this means the sum total of something. It's complete, okay? So for him, from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. So the fullness of deity means that Jesus reveals God because everything that God is by nature resides fully in him. Every divine attribute, every aspect of God's glory, power, holiness, truth, and life dwells fully in him. Therefore, when the Word became flesh, God did not send a partial revelation of himself. He came personally in the person of his Son. Think about everything that God was, all of those attributes. We talked about the attributes of God last week. All of those attributes resided in Jesus, every one of them. Now, he chose to suppress them when he had to because he was 100% fully God and 100% fully man. Okay? He didn't walk around just, zapping things and doing all these miracles. He did them when he needed to do them to show his power, but he didn't walk around and say, hey, I'm God, I can do anything. He wanted people to relate to him as his humanity, all right? Christ's fullness, the fullness of his deity, which Colossians talked about, is the source of grace. So we have all received grace upon grace. And in Christ's fullness, that's the source of all the grace. The Old Covenant was an expression of God's grace, the Old Testament, right? And I'll explain how here in a second. But the New Covenant, it reveals the fullness of his grace. Now, then in the next verse, it says, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Okay, so we're talking about grace. We're talking about there had to be some kind of covering and atonement for sins in the Old Testament, right? So the grace expressed through the Levitical sacrifices, through the law, it provided that temporary covenant provision for Israel. It provided a covering for their sins, an atonement. But it always pointed forward to the coming of the Messiah. It never permanently washed away their sins. The blood of bulls and goats was never fully sufficient to erase their sins completely. Jesus, once for all sacrifice, accomplished that permanently. Okay? All those things were only a foreshadowing. The grace given through Moses, through that system, prepared the way for the greater grace that came through Jesus, who fulfilled God's redemptive plan. So when you look at that verse again, for the law was given through, well, let's go back. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Old Testament grace given through the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, all the way up to the grace that was received from the fullness of Jesus Christ. And then finally, no one has ever seen God. God, the only Son who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. All right. It's true. No one has ever seen God the Father. Okay? God's invisible. He's infinite. He's incomprehensible to us. Right? Anselm, that I talked about last week, said God is the most maximally great being that you could ever conceive. We can't understand. We can't even imagine how we could see God, if you think about it. No human has ever seen his fullness in his divine essence. Nobody has. Okay? Whenever God appeared in the Old Testament, they saw a manifestation of God, not the totality of God's being. But remember, Moses asked God, show me your glory. And God revealed his name. He said, I am who I am. I'm eternal. Basically, that says you can't comprehend me. You can't. You just can't. Okay? But God told Moses, you can't see my face, for no man can see me and live. But God did reveal himself to Moses partially. He told Moses to go to a certain place and he would pass through. And he saw whatever would consist of God's backside of the eternal God. I have no idea what that means. But that's what he revealed himself to Moses partially. We can't see that. But John brings this around full circle, right? God has now been revealed through Jesus Christ. Now you can look at Jesus Christ. We can't, obviously, but they could, and see God. All the fullness of deity lived in Jesus. To me, that's pretty amazing when you think about it. So, Jesus is unique. No created being shares this relationship with God. He is, and he not was at the Father's side. He is at the Father's side. So, before the universe, before space, before time and matter, which that's everything that exists in the created universe, space, time, and matter. There's nothing other than one of those three. There was an eternal, a beginningless fellowship between the Father and the Son. Jesus said in John 14, he who has seen me has seen the Father. And then finally, at the end of the passage, he says, he has made him known. The Greek word for that, he has made him known, is actually exogeomai, which is the root word of exegesis. And if any of you guys, I don't know, some of you guys, maybe a couple, have taken Alex and I's How to Study the Bible class, we talk about exegesis. We talk about how to study the Bible, and exegesis is basically taking completely out from the text. It's basically saying whatever the text says, we're going to take that, and that's what we're going to build our foundation on. We're not going to look at a text and say, but I think it might mean something a little bit different. Or the other word for that is exegete. Okay? We're not going to exegete it. We're going to exegesis, or I guess that's the proper word. Eisegesis. Yeah, sorry. We're not going to, yeah. Anyway, I get mixed up on the terms. That's not really what I was going to talk about today. But it's basically to bring forth the word, and that's what John is saying here, that no one has ever seen God, God the only Son who's at the Father's side. He has made him known. Jesus made the Father known. Okay? So this verb links the eternal word of the Father's self-disclosure. Jesus personally interprets the invisible God because the Son exegetes the Father. Believers receive a sure, sufficient, and climactic revelation that completes the progressive unveiling begun in the Old Testament. That statement right there was from the Bible Hub. It's basically the topical lexicon that breaks down the words, and that's what they said. This verb links the eternal word to the Father's self-disclosure. Okay, Jesus interprets the invisible God. All right, I'm going to wrap this up with just some final questions. These questions we ask ourselves a lot of times when we're starting to think about God. What is God like? What does God desire? How does God love? How does God judge? And how does God save? John answers that question. In this prologue, basically, he answers that question. How does he answer it? Look at Jesus. That's what it is. That's what God's like. Like, look at Jesus.